In this video lesson, we are going to discuss the religious education in Bulgaria, its history and present. Bulgaria is a secular state on the Balkan Peninsula. Like most European states, it is a multi-ethnic and multicultural country where different ethnic groups of people live. The traditional religion in Bulgaria is Orthodox Christianity. The country also presents other religions and faiths. Islam has the second place in Bulgaria by both influence and number of adherents. It is followed by the Protestant community and the Roman Catholics. There are also Russian, Romanian, evangelical churches, and a small number of representatives of Judaism. From a historical perspective, the concept of education has been directly linked to religions through their institutional component, the school. By their very nature, the schools in Bulgaria were church schools, and the history of religious education, which reflects the relationship between the church and the state, could, in a sense, be construed as a history of the convergence or the alienation of these two institutions. Religious education in Bulgaria can be traced back to the Christianization of the population by Saint Tsar Boris I in 865 and can be divided into several phases. The first phase lasted until 1835. During this time, education was purely Christian. Schools belonged to the church, and their primary objective was the preparation of clerics. The opening of the first secular school in Bulgaria in 1835 marked the beginning of the phase of secular education, characterized by a new type of school, new educational goals and needs. This period lasted until 1947, when religious education was excluded from the curriculum. It can be provisionally divided into two sub-periods. From 1835 until the liberation from the Ottoman yoke in 1878, and from the liberation until 1948. The first sub-period saw the gradual separation of school and church. Schools were now open to secular teachers. Secular sciences began to take over the subject of liturgical practice, and church books were replaced by school textbooks. At this time, the opposition between secular and spiritual education, i.e. one dedicated to the preparation of clerics, but not religious, as an element of the learning content, began to emerge. Secular was construed as of this world, or of man, and at the same time, religion had a significant role in the Bulgarian primary education system. In the second sub-period, religion gradually lost its status as a primary school subject. In some schools, religious instruction was even barely taught or discontinued. The history of religious education after 1878 is an illustration of the gradual division of the state and the school from the church. Until the First World War, most of the teachers were graduates of spiritual seminaries. After the war, their teaching entitlement was limited almost exclusively to the teaching of religion. During this period, secular began to be opposed to religious, and science to faith. Following a series of legislative changes, the subject of religion was pushed to the edge of the educational system. The closure of this process marked the transition to the third phase in the history of religious education in Bulgaria, the Communist era. With the adoption of the so-called Dimitrov Constitution on 4 December 1947, education became a secular domain, and the school a domain of the state. Science lay at the basis of the educational system and was construed in atheistic and anti-religious terms. The last phase in the development of religious education in Bulgaria began with the fall of the communist regime in 1989 and is still ongoing. After 1989, communist ideology was abolished from the educational system, but the study of religion was not restored. On the grounds of the secular nature of the Bulgarian schools, until 1996, theological graduates were officially denied access to teaching in schools. In the 1997-1998 school year, for the first time in the recent history of Bulgaria, religion was admitted into the school system as an elective subject, and immediately began to be taught by theologians in many schools. Religious freedom is first of all an individual freedom, as each person can decide whether or not to join a religion and whether or not to accept its doctrine. But it is also a collective freedom, in the sense that it does not limit itself to a faith or to religious confession, but ultimately leads to a practice whose free exercise should be guaranteed. Confessions have the right to conduct services of worship, ceremonies, and rituals, to receive public funds, and to administer their internal organizational operation by themselves. According to the Bulgarian Constitution, confessions are free and religious institutions are separate from the state. The Republic of Bulgaria guarantees a freedom of confession. This means that the state is duty-bound to respect this freedom, and that it commits itself to preventing the violation of any such rights by any third party. The secular character of the state guarantees the protection of rights and religious liberties of all citizens. The Constitution also guarantees independence of religious institutions and communities. Religious institutions which are separate from the state stand on an equal footing. The Eastern Orthodox Confession is explicitly mentioned in Article 13 of the Constitution, but this does not provide a basis for privileges or preferences. The use of the term religion in the said article is with regards to Christianity, Islam, Judaism, etc. Christianity is a religion, while Orthodoxy, Roman Catholicism, and Protestantism are confessions within Christianity. Concerning the meaning of the term traditional, the Constitutional Court has stated that the traditional character of the Eastern Orthodox Confession expresses its cultural and historical role and its importance to the Bulgarian state, as well as its present-day importance to the life of the state, which is reflected primarily in the system of public holidays. In other words, the state legislation today is liberal. It is in harmony with the fundamental and normative acts and documents of the international and of the European legal system, and is a sufficient guarantee for the religious liberties of citizens. According to the Bulgarian Orthodox Church, the main goal of religious education is the formation of spiritual culture and moral identity of students, their personal development and support for their orientation, adaptation, and successful participation in society. Religion lies at the core of the cultural identity. Faced with today's global challenges, religious conflicts, terrorist threats, and immigrant waves, we all realize that religious education is not just an issue concerning religious institutions, but that it is above all a matter of state policy and a responsible political decision, which can determine our common European future. Unfortunately, we need to point to the continuing secularization of Bulgarian society, as well as other European societies too, which could negatively influence the efforts for establishing religious education on firmer ground. Teaching religion in Bulgaria is subject to the general rules of education in the country. The education system, on the other hand, has its grounds both in the constitution and in the Bulgarian legislation. Teaching religion at schools takes place in accordance with the Ministry of Education concepts. Such concepts were created and presented earlier to the Ministry of Education, both by the Christian and the Muslim religious communities. The other religious communities are also allowed to organize their own religious classes at schools, provided they comply with the terms and conditions of teaching school subjects at the state schools. These apply to the minimum number of students in class, currently 13 for the elective subjects, the quality of teachers, and the conditions provided by the schools for the teaching of religion. Here we need to point out that this practice does not mean discrimination of any religious organization in the country. It only means that the state wants to be sure that all school subjects, including religion, are taught according to the same rules, and that the teaching process occurs in normal conditions for all students. In Bulgaria, there are 2 Eastern Orthodox seminaries for students from 14 to 19 years old, one in the city of Sofia and the other in the city of Plovdiv. They are both supported financially by the Bulgarian Orthodox Church. The Ministry of Education, however, provides salaries for the teachers and oversees the educational process, as far as the secular school subjects are concerned, so that the seminaries comply with the general requirements of the education system. The 2 religious schools train the clergy of the Bulgarian Orthodox Church. In 2014, a new Orthodox spiritual academy was opened in the city of Plovdiv. It was supported financially only by the Bulgarian Orthodox Church. The academy offers bachelor's degree programs and prepares mostly theologians and clergy to work and serve in the structures of the church. Religious education teachers in Bulgaria are professionally and pedagogically trained in the theological faculties of the university in Sofia and Veliko Tarnovo, and in the theological departments of the universities in Plovdiv and Shumen. The students study all necessary pedagogical and psychological university disciplines, including teaching practice at schools. And in this way, they acquire higher skills to teach both in secular schools and in specialized Christian schools and colleges. There are other Christian schools in Bulgaria too, where mostly believers from different Protestant communities study. In 1991, a Pentecostal theological faculty was opened in the city of Rus. In 1999, it was transformed into a higher evangelical theological institute, where students from almost all evangelical churches in the country study. The students get a bachelor's degree, although their diplomas are not recognized by the Ministry of Education, because the institute does not meet certain educational standards. The diplomas, however, are recognized by many educational Christian departments in other countries, mostly Western. After graduation, the students of this institute become pastors of churches in their communities, and some of them continue their education in other universities. Another educational Christian establishment is in the Victory Christian Center, where mostly students of the United Church of God study. Although teaching is done in a form similar to Bible courses, the students study mainly in 2 programs: pastoral and biblical. The graduates work as pastors in churches, or as evangelists, preachers, or other types of missionary work in their communities and beyond. Christian educational activity is done also by the Pistis School for Christian Ministers, which is the educational body of the Evangelical Christian Center in Sofia. Founded in 2012, today it offers 2-year study programs. The graduation certificates are not recognized by the state. they mostly have a nominal value for local evangelical churches. Students belonging to the evangelical and wider Protestant churches also study at the theological faculties of the Bulgarian universities, although they have been established as Eastern Orthodox educational schools, and their curricula and syllabus continue to be generally Orthodox. This fact shows another important tendency of the theological education in Bulgaria: its interdenominational character. The second numerous religious community in Bulgaria is the Muslim community. It has its own religious schools, which are maintained only by the community. In our case, this is the Bulgarian Grand Mufti's office in Sofia. In the early 1990s, the Islamic schools were opened in the cities of Rus and Shumen and in the town of Momchilgrad. They were established as private schools, and their activity was not well known until 1998, when they received the approval of the Directorate of Religious Affairs. The same year, the Higher Islamic Institute was established in Sofia and was approved by the Directorate too. The teachers in the religion of the 3 Islamic secondary schools receive training in the Islamic Institute. The educational activity of the institute has been approved by the state, but the diplomas of the graduates are not recognized by the Ministry of Education, as its educational policy does not fully comply with the educational requirements of the government. The 3 Islamic secondary schools were acknowledged by the Ministry of Education, and their graduates receive state certificates for secondary education on an equal basis with the graduates of all other Bulgarian schools. They accept students from 15 to 19 years old who study all obligatory school subjects taught at Bulgarian secondary schools. In this way, Muslim schools function on the same pedagogical level with all other schools in the country. They study a couple of Islamic subjects, most notably the Quran. The subjects are taught by Muslim teachers, who can be pedagogically qualified, or they can be any Islamic preacher or scholar. That is, the special religious school subjects stand outside the pedagogical requirements of the state. Teaching is only in the Bulgarian language, except for the teaching of the Quran, which is in Arabic or Turkish. It is known that the 3 Islamic schools are self-supported, but some support may also come from Turkey. According to the teachers, around 80% of the students find realization in the secular society, or continue their study at universities, and some 20% of the boys become imams. From the brief overview of the religious schools in Bulgaria, we can see that they function according to the principles of tolerance and respect for the needs and the interests of every believer in the country, irrespective of their religion. What is common for all religious schools is the fact that they all function in the society as indicators of the religious diversity of the country and its multi-ethnic, multicultural character. This is why their role in society is important for keeping religious tolerance among the believers of different religious groups. The contemporary conditions of life of the European countries in their cultural diversity inevitably requires respect for the religious diversity. These principles enable different religious institutions, organizations, schools, foundations, etc. to properly function in Bulgaria, to equally work for the benefit of everyone in society, not only for the benefit of their own members. At the same time, these principles allow each religious community and religious school to organize their life without any interference on the part of the state authorities. It also establishes the ground on which different Christian schools and institutions do their activities. Communities enjoy their constitutional rights, work and live according to the precepts of their religion. Attention to religious diversity is paid also in teaching religion in the state schools, where the textbooks of the different religions would give information about the understandings and practices of other religions too. This greatly contributes to the higher integration of the Bulgarian society as a unified nation of different believers and religious groups within the country.